Hi everyone, my name's Diabedor, and today Elden Ring patch 1.14 came out, and it included a bunch of changes, but the one that I found the most interesting was the buff to RELLANA'S Cameo. RELLANA'S Cameo just got a huge buff. It used to be a 15% damage bonus for Ashes of War that have a stance, where you hold the stance for a little while and then you get the damage buff afterwards, but now it's 45%, which is just nuts. Not only did they buff its damage bonus, but they also shortened the time that it takes before you get the damage bonus, making it a lot more usable on a lot more Ashes of War in a lot more situations. And what's especially ridiculous about it is that since it's buffing your Ashes of War, that means you can combine it with Shard of Alexander for the 15% damage bonus that provides, and get even more obscene damage out of it. And if you throw in other buffs alongside it, like the Rakshasa Armor and Golden Vow, then you just start doing ungodly amounts of damage. So I decided to throw together a quick build to show off just how ridiculous this talisman is now. I think this thing is absolutely absurd, and now it's time for me to shut up and start talking about the build. So first, let's talk about the stats. As usual, I decided to make this build at level 125 because that's the meta PvP level. That's the level that I personally prefer to make my builds at. If you want to go higher, then you absolutely can. I'll include a short leveling guide in the description in case you want to know how to level up your stats. Going up to probably like 200 is probably where I'll stop the leveling guide. But honestly, the stats are really simple, so I decided to go with 50 vigor because that's just a good amount to have. 40 is the bare minimum that you want, and preferably you'd go up to 60, but since I'm only at level 125, I decided to take the middle ground and go to 50. Vigor is always the most important stat on any build, so make sure you don't skimp out on the vigor. After that, we've got 15 mind. If you bring this build up to a higher level, then preferably you'd go up to like 20 mind, because we're going to cast 3 buffs that use a bunch of FP, and so you're going to see when I do the buffing process, I cast 2 of the buffs, then I have to drink a blue flask, and then I can cast the 3rd one. So going up to 20 would save you a little bit of trouble, but you're really not going to be hurting for FP during a boss fight or anything, because the Ashes of War that we're using, the ones that are compatible with RELLANA'S Cameo, don't use all that much FP. So you don't have to worry too much about mind. We have 20 endurance, so that we can medium roll with all of the armor and stuff that we have equipped, which I'll talk about once I get to that section. After that, we've got our damage stats. Our first one is strength. As you can see, this is a strength build, so I went up to 53 strength. I would have gone to 54, but I needed a few points to put into dexterity, so I kept strength at 53. I brought dex up to 13. So with Millicent's Prosthesis, we have a total of 18 dex, so we can wield all the weapons that we're using. And then finally, I left Intelligence Arcane alone, and I brought Faith up to 33, so that we can cast the buff spells up to Howl of Shabriri. That's it for the stats. Now let's talk about the weapons, armor, and talismans. So you have a wide choice of weapons with this build. RELLANA'S Cameo affects a few different Ashes of War, and some of them can be put on multiple weapons, mainly the straight swords. So to be specific, Square Off goes on any straight sword, Overhead Stance only goes on the Great Katana, Wing Stance goes only on the Milady, and then you've got Unsheathed, which can go on the Uchi Katana or the Nagakiba. There's also the Ashes of War for the Sword of Night and Flame, RELLANA'S Twin Blades, and Moonveil, but I decided not to include those because I wanted to try to keep this build simple, and so that's why I just made it a strength build. You'll find a link to the build in the description, and if you check the weapons inventory, you'll see I decided to leave a bunch of weapons with the appropriate Ashes of War on them, so that you can have a bunch of different options to try stuff out. You'll see I included 2 broadswords, and that's because my idea was that you would use the dual straight sword moveset to proc up the multi-hit buff on Millicent's Prosthesis, and then in addition to that damage buff, you would then do the stance for RELLANA'S Cameo. But the problem is that Millicent's Prosthesis decays after like 1.2 seconds or something like that, so you're never gonna really get any significant damage buff off of it, and so that's why you're not gonna see me doing that in this build. But if you want to power stance, you know, straight swords, katanas, whatever, then you have the option to do that with this build. There's absolutely nothing stopping you from doing that. Just the main thing that we're focusing on is the Ash of War. In addition to those weapons, you'll also see we have the Dragon Communion Seal. So with this build, we're not casting any damaging spells, we're only casting buff spells, and so those aren't affected by your seal's incant scaling or anything like that. So I went with the Dragon Communion Seal because it's weightless and it's super easy to get, If you wanted to cast damaging spells, then you would want to use the Clawmark Seal, because that gets strength scaling and faith scaling for the spells that you cast, but I didn't include that in this build because I'm focusing on the RELLANA'S Cameo. Speaking of the cameo, for our talismans, of course, the first one that we have equipped is RELLANA'S Cameo, because that's what this entire video is about. We also have Millicent's Prosthesis. We're mainly using it for the +5 dex bonus that it gives you, but it also has the successive attack bonus, where if you hit an enemy multiple times in a short period of time, then you start getting an increasing damage bonus, and so that can come in handy a lot for some of the Ashes of War, like the wing stance on the Milady. So that's really useful to have, but again, it's mainly for the +5 dex, and if you wanted to have a slightly lighter talisman, then you can use the Prosthesis Wearer's Heirloom instead, which is just +5 dex. In addition to that, we've got Shard of Alexander, because that buffs our Ash of War damage, and since this is an Ash of War spamming build, we definitely want that. So between that and RELLANA'S Cameo, you have like a 60% damage bonus already, which is nuts. But then, I included the Blade of Mercy, because most of the Ashes of War that we're using, Square Off, Unsheath, and Wing Stance specifically, those do a bunch of poise damage when you do the heavy attack version of it, and so you're going to be getting a bunch of stats breaks with this build, and so if you go for the crit, then Blade of Mercy gives you another 20% damage bonus on top of that, and so after the crit, for like 20 seconds, I think is how long the Blade of Mercy buff lasts, you're just going to be doing like ridiculous amounts of fucking damage. Now, if you wanted, you could swap that out for something like Dragon Crest Great Shield to make up for the extra damage that we're going to be taking because of Rakshasa's armor and because of Hal Shabriri, which I'll talk about once we talk about the spells and armor. But personally, I would stick with Blade of Mercy because that extra 20% after getting a crit is just absurd. It's so much fucking damage, even without the rest of this build. It's just a spectacular talisman to have. It's an S tier talisman, 100%. And then finally, for armor, I went with the Rakshasa set because I'm trying to get the biggest damage numbers possible. Each piece of the Rakshasa set gives you a 2% damage buff to all damage that you do. So if you're wearing the full set, it's an 8% extra damage, and that really adds up a lot over time. Now, the downside to the Rakshasa set is that it also has low defensive stats, so it doesn't protect you all that much compared to other armors, and it's pretty heavy, but we've got the stats for it, and we'll be using 1 or 2 defensive buffs that'll make up for that, so it's definitely worth the trade-off if you have the Rakshasa set. If not, you can go for something like the Knight Armor, or you can get something with other buffs like the Raptor's Black Feathers, or you could get something like the Briar Armor. So we're using the Blade of Mercy. That relies on us getting stance breaks so that we can do ripostes and get the buff from the Blade of Mercy. So if you go a few seconds without attacking an enemy, then all their stance damage that they've taken will regenerate, and you'll have to start over when it comes to stance breaking them. So if you wear the Briar Armor, then that makes your rolls do a little bit of damage. It's not much, so you don't use the Briar Armor for the damage it does, but it also does a little bit of poise damage. It's a very, very small amount, but it's just enough that if you roll into an enemy with the Briar Armor on, then it'll prevent their poise bar from regenerating. It resets the timer that it takes for them to regenerate. And so that makes it a lot easier to maintain the enemy's stance damage and get stance breaks on them. So if you're not using the Rakshasa set, then you can go with the Briar Armor, which a lot of people think looks really cool. Personally, I don't care for it, but a lot of people say it looks really cool. It's not as heavy, it provides better damage negation, and it makes your rolls do damage, thus making the Blade of Mercy a little bit more viable. So that's definitely the alternative that I would recommend. That's it for the weapons, talismans, and armor, so now let's talk about the spells and crystal tiers that we're going to be using. With 33 Faith, we have access to a lot of incantations. I specifically went with Golden Vow, Howl of Shabriri, and Blessing's Boon. So Golden Vow gives you a 15% damage bonus and a 10% damage negation bonus for 80 seconds. So Golden Vow is just a super strong spell. It's really, really useful. If you have the faith for it, you should be using it. It only requires 25 faith, so it's not that much. And that damage negation bonus is really nice because that'll help make up for the Rakshasa armor having low damage negation, and it also kind of helps with Howl of Shabriri. So when you cast Howl of Shabriri, you do 25% more damage, but you take 30% more damage for 40 seconds. So it's a trade-off, but the extra damage is what we're looking for, and it's a fuckload of damage, so it's really important that you use Howl of Shibiri. Alternatively, you could use something like Flame Grant Me Strength, or even like Exalted Flesh instead, but those don't last as long, and they're not as strong as Howl, so I strongly recommend just using Howl. And then our final spell is Blessing's Boon. Blessing's Boon is a health regen spell. It gives you 8 health per second for 90 seconds. So not only is it just good in general to have health regen, because it makes it a little bit easier to stay alive during boss fights, but it also helps to negate the effect of the blood-sucking crack tier that we're using. So the blood-sucking crack tier gives you a 20% damage bonus, but it drains your health by 20 points per second plus 0.2% of your max HP. So it's going to be something like minus 23 health per second or something like that. I don't know the exact number. But having Blessing's Boon active will help to negate that just a bit and make it easier to stay alive. If you don't like the idea of having your health drain over time, then you could use something like the Thorny Crack tier, which will stack with Millicent's Prosthesis. It also provides a multi-hit buff, so that's really good if you're using the Wing Stance Ash of War on the Milady. Or you could use something like the Winged Crystal tier, which basically gives you light rolls for 3 minutes. You have a bunch of options, and you can experiment with different tiers if you want, but the one that'll give us the biggest damage is going to be the Blood-Sucking Crack tier, so that's the one that I went with, and I think it is definitely worth the trade-off of having your health drain over time, because having that extra 20% damage plus all these other buffs, again, is just absurd. And that concludes the breakdown of this build. I'm trying to keep this video relatively short, so I'm not going to include an item location guide because that would take another hour because a lot of these items are in the DLC. But down in the description, I'll provide links to their wiki pages so that you can have a guide for how to get to each of them. And with all that said, let's look at some gameplay where I'll talk about this build and how you can get the most out of it. So the first boss I decided to test this thing on was Commander Gaius, because he's annoying as hell, and I want to see if I can make a big number against him. So before the fight, make sure you cast all your buffs. You want to drink the Physic, and I did it in the wrong order here in this clip. You're going to see in the other clips I do it a different order. You should cast Blessing's Boon, then Golden Vow, then Howl of Shibiri, because that's the order of the longest lasting buff to the shortest lasting buff. So make sure you do it in the correct order. You also noticed, you may have seen there that I have the Milady set to Keen because I had forgotten to switch it to Heavy when I respect my character for this build. So I could be doing significantly more damage here, but you'll see that even on Keen with such low dexterity, I'm still doing a fuckload of damage to this guy with each hit. 3 hits and he's already entering phase 2. So, the important thing is to make sure, oh, by the way, you can dodge into this and you get a free punish. But so the most important thing is to make sure that you charge the stance for the whole second. You have to hold it for 1 second before the buff kicks in. So, you can do it, and then, you'll see there's going to be a, the damage buff aura around you, like that red buff that pops up after the second. But you might also want to try to count it, go 1/1000 or whatever to count it. Especially because something you might notice is that when I get a crit on an enemy, after that, while the Blade of Mercy buff is active, the RELLANA'S Cameo buff doesn't appear on the character because it's being, the visual effect is being overwritten by the Blade of Mercy's buff. So that's one little bit of incompatibility. The buffs do stack, but you don't get the visual of both of them at the same time. So when you get the crit, it might be a little bit more difficult to actually successfully use the cameo. So just hold it for a bit longer than you think you need to, and you should be fine every time. So for my next fight, I decided to fight Romina, and this time I used the broadsword with Square Off, because Square Off is just super strong. Romina only has 80 poise, and Square Off does 40 poise when you do the heavy attack version of it. So it's going to Stance Break her in 2 hits, and so I thought that made her a really good example. It also does a fuckload of damage to her. So now I successfully have my sword set to heavy, so I'm doing a shitload of damage. That first hit was over 6,000 damage. So I get the crit here, and decided to get greedy and go for an attack. it was a bad idea. Don't do that. Especially since Romina does her fucking phase change like instantly as soon as she gets to half health. You see here, I'm hitting her with fan daggers to try to maintain any stance damage that I might have done to her. So, like before, I was talking about having the Briar armor. Another thing you can do to make it easier to get stance breaks is you use fan daggers or throwing daggers or even like poison bone daggers if you want to also do some poison buildup. But you get some kind of fast throwing consumable like fan daggers, and if the boss runs away from you, or if you have to roll and run away from the boss or whatever, just hit it with a fan dagger. That damage will prevent its poise from regenerating, and that makes getting poise breaks a lot more consistent. Like that. And so I get another poise break, and then I crit her, and she's dead. I think, yeah, she's still like one hit, because I didn't quite do enough damage, but yeah. So, yeah, you know, like, this shit's doing a ton of damage now. That 45% damage buff is absurd. And then what makes it really interesting is just how well it synergizes with the Blade of Mercy specifically, because most of the stance Ashes of War do, or at least have an option to do a ton of poise damage. And so you can just, you know, you're going to consistently get stance breaks. Like in this one, so I decided to switch over to the Uchi Katana because it has the Unsheath. And that is just a super strong stance, and you can see, you know, taking off a 5600 damage chunk off of the Divine Beast. Seems pretty good to me, you know, it's pretty ridiculous. And I want to say, there are definitely ways that this build can be optimized more. For example, I'm pretty sure this would actually be better if we were doing like a bleed build, if I decided to focus on you know, using like the Uchi and the Great Katana with, or even like the broadsword or whatever. If we were using like Occult on the Uchi, or if we were using Blood on the broadsword or something, then we could use something like maybe you know, White Mask instead of the Rakshasa helm, and we could get something like Lord of Blood's Exaltation instead of, maybe I would probably swap out Millicent's Prosthesis for Lord of Blood's Exaltation, and that way you would get 10% damage buff from White Mask and 20% damage buff from Lord of Blood's Exaltation every time you proc a bleed on an enemy, and that would just be even more absurd. And again, that also synergizes really well with these things, because, for example, we have the Great Katana, which is overhead stance, and you're going to see here in this clip, I put Blood Grease on it, because I figured since we have it on a heavy build, I could put Blood Grease on it, and it does 55 bleed buildup innately, and so you add the Blood Grease to it, and that brings it up to 85. So you saw there, the overhead stance heavy attack version does 3 hits, and so that makes it reasonably good for doing status buildup. So if I just had this thing infused Occult or whatever, and I was doing even more bleed buildup, then I'd be proccing bleeds left and right with it, you know? Or better yet, you can get the Milady with Wing Stance. Oh, by the way, you can crouch underneath this attack. Midra, best boss fight in the game, easily. Midra is so good. Midra is such a solid fucking boss. But anyway, I don't want to get too off topic. So like I was saying, which I don't remember what I was saying, hang on. I was talking about using the Milady with Wing Stance, because Wing Stance has the light attack variant that also does 3 hits in a row, but it's way faster than the overhead stance here on the Great Katana. So if you had like a Blood Milady, then you could use that Wing Stance light attack and do just ridiculous amounts of bleed buildup. Plus, you could also be proccing something like Millicent's Prosthesis if you were using that. You know, maybe you might switch out like Lord of Blood's Exaltation with the Blade of Mercy instead of Millicent's Prosthesis or whatever. So if you had that, you could have Thorny Cracked here in your Wondrous Physic. You might have Rotten Wing Sword Insignia equipped or something. And so not only would you be getting bleeds, plus the bleed procs and proccing the buffs for the Lord of Blood's Exaltation and the White Mask, but you would also be proccing the multi-hit buffs, and you'd be doing absurd amounts of damage. Like, we're getting into, like, farcical amounts of damage here with the amount of buff stacking that I'm talking about right now, you know? Like, this is, like, obscene damage. And so, speaking of the Milady, I decided to fight Bale, because, you know, he's Bale, he's cool, he's got a bunch of health, he's tough. Also a very solid boss fight, really, really good boss fight. The DLC is fucking great. I love this DLC. But anyway, so I decided to fight Bill, and I decided to use Wing Stance because I like the heavy attack thrust there. And you saw I did 8,600 damage. So not only is that because of all the buffs and stuff that we're using, but I also have an opportunity to use the Dragon Communion Grease, which is what you see on the Milady. I mean, look at that. Look at how quickly you've taken him down to like a third of his health. This talisman is like stupid now. You know, I'm assuming it's gonna get nerfed because 45% is fucking ridiculous. I hope it doesn't because I love it, but I won't be surprised if it does. But anyway, so now I've added Dragon Communion Grease, which I believe gives you a 20% physical damage bonus against dragons. I'm not going to check that because it's not that important because you only use it against dragons. But Dragon Communion Grease, if you're fighting dragons, it's a kind of a no-brainer, you know, and so that adds a fuckload of damage. Now that the grease and a couple of the buffs have worn off, I'm still doing 5,000 damage per hit, which is pretty good, you know. You really can't, like, argue with that. Here's the laser attack. I have no idea how to dodge this one. Yeah. That's something I need to get around to learning. And another thing you might have noticed is that these fights are taking a little while, and that's only because I suck. It's not because of the damage, because, you know, when I'm hitting the boss, it does a whole bunch of damage. It's just that I keep getting owned, and so that's why these fights are taking a while. But even then, like, it's still not even taking all that long. Here, I get hit by his nuke like an idiot, but I survive it. You know, that's why you have 50 vigor, you know. And plus the Opaline hard tier and all that, you know, it's really good to have those defensive buffs and stuff. But yeah, so like I suck, I'm getting owned by the bosses in these clips, but I'm still just shredding them because it just does so much damage. You know, like it just adds such a ridiculous amount of damage for no investment at all. You know, like you can put RELLANA'S Cameo on any build and just grab a fucking square off straight sword or something, or, you know, a Milady. And by the way, here, instead of doing the slow one, I did the light attack there just to finish him off. You don't have to hold the stance every time. You can just do it immediately. But anyway, so like I was saying, you can just get like, you know, a square off straight sword or anything and just slap it on any build. And as long as you give it the affinity that's appropriate for your stats, so like, for example, if you're a magic build, then you would want to give your sword the magic affinity so it scales with intelligence and does magic damage. That will get buffed by RELLANA'S Cameo, right? Like, no matter what weapon you're using, as long as you have the talisman and you have the right stats for your affinity, you're going to do an ungodly amount of damage. So you don't even need, like, a dedicated build for this talisman. You can just be like, okay, you know, for this enemy, I'm going to whip out the fucking straight sword and I'm going to blast him with RELLANA'S Cameo or whatever. You know, oh, for this dragon, since it's big, I'm going to pull out the great katana so that I can hit, you know, upwards with the overhead stance using RELLANA'S Cameo and just, you know, like shred its head. And with my first impressions with this buff, I would go as far as to call this talisman like overpowered now, because not necessarily just because of the 45%, you know, bonus that it gives you, though of course that is a ridiculous amount of damage, but also because it's just so universal. Right? RELLANA'S Cameo doesn't affect every Ash of War in the game. It only affects like 7 or 8 Ashes of War. But you can use multiple of those Ashes of War on any character. You know? Like, you can get even like the most basic straight sword. You grab like a long sword or even a short sword or something, put square off on it, and now you have something that's capable of doing like 5,000 or 6,000 damage per hit if you equip this fucking talisman, right? Like, that's kind of stupid. Like, I don't know how else to put it. Personally, I'm completely fine with that because this talisman has been fun as hell so far, especially since these stancers are so cool. This great katana is so cool, bro. Such an awesome weapon. Definitely one that I need to get around to using more. Or like the Milady. I love the Milady. It's currently my favorite weapon in the game. And even something like the Milady, you know, like straight swords you can put on any build. You can get a short sword or weathered straight sword or whatever. But like even something like the Milady, it only requires 12 strength and 17 dex. Like, that's pretty much nothing, you know? Like, most builds are going to have at least like 10 to 15 dex, you know? So an extra 2 points is nothing. And I mean, just look at how much damage you can do. This is Dragon Barrow, which has endgame scaling in New Game +1. So it's my first New Game Plus on this character. And, you know, I killed that dude in 4 fucking hits because it just adds so much damage. Even without all the other buffs, it still would have only been 5 or 6 hits from the Ash of War because RELLANA'S Cameo plus Shard of Alexander is increasing my damage by, I think the wiki said it was like 67%. You know, like, it's ridiculous. Getting that much of a buff on, like, several weapons that are already super solid, using Ashes of War that are super solid, by just equipping a talisman, you get that much buff, you know? Like, it's kind of nuts. And so that's why I'm saying my entire point that I'm leading up to, which I already kind of said, but I'm going to say it again, is I'm willing to bet that they're going to end up nerfing this talisman, so use it while you can, because so far this has been hilariously fun, and I love it, and I hope they don't nerf it. But anyway, I think this video has gone on for more than long enough, so I hope you found this helpful, or at least entertaining. I strongly suggest you try this build out, or at least something similar to it using this talisman, because it does so much damage that it's just hilarious, and I had a lot of fun using it, and I'm about to keep using it once I get on the game after I finish editing and uploading this video. So yeah, try it out. My speculation is that it's going to get nerfed. Hopefully it doesn't, but either way, if you enjoyed this video, please leave a like, share the video, and consider subscribing because it really helps me out. My name is Diabetor, and I will catch you later.